So now kindly silence your cell phone so that there's no interruptions. And it's my pleasure to introduce this distinguished panel of authors. And somebody up there must really like me, to put me here with this group. First we have Scott McCloud, author of Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics, and Making Comics. Next we have Cory Doctorow, author of In Real Life, by Cory Doctorow and Jen Wang, and Mr. Calvin Reid.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for my I'm the senior news editor at Publishers Weekly, the trade journal for the book publishing industry, and I also edit PW Comics World, our online coverage for comics and graphic novels, and you can check it out at publishersweekly.com/comics. We also do a weekly podcast, so you can check us out that way. But today we're going to talk a little bit about both these wonderful two authors we have here, but also about the state of contemporary comics. We live in a brave new world of comics today, in terms of how they're made, how they're produced, how they get to the, in fact, holy comics, they're not even comics anymore, they're books. So we're going to talk about graphic novels, we're going to talk about how this medium that we love, what it has become, and maybe a little bit about where it's going. So there's so many topics. We're going to just start out. We're going to talk for about a half an hour among ourselves here. Then we want to get some questions from the audience. We're going to alternate genders, so everybody gets a chance. So, as I said before, hold on to your seats. We're living in probably the most diverse time for comics out there. And when I say diversity, I mean in all kinds of ways. So we'll kind of investigate that a little bit just to get started. I grew up essentially in a one-genre comics market. That's no longer the case. Superhero comics are great. They made me the comics nerd I am today. However, that's just one part of the story, and the U.S. market today has been really transformed by not only different kinds of comics, but different kinds of comics creators. So let's talk about that a little bit. Earlier today I sort of threw out a provocative comment, mostly about are DC and Marvel irrelevant? Now, you can take that wherever you want. And I don't mean is the superhero genre irrelevant, more so their shepherding of what the notion of a comic is. So where are we today? We've seen more diversity of genre in the U.S. comic market in particular than ever before. Have we finally broken out of the one genre U.S. comic market? Either of you want to take it, Cory?
Well, I guess the thing that you can say for sure about both Marvel and DC is whether or not those entities exist today as film development organs that are a cheap way to spitball a lot of different film development ideas, that they're so big and they're run by such big, sprawling, poorly managed media empires that they do the stuff that's weird and unexpected. And so I every day do a retrospective. I go through my blog posts from 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and 1 year ago. And we just hit the 10th anniversary of my review of Paul Pope's Batman Year 100, which DC and Marvel are still doing books like this. Like China Mayville just did a Dial H reboot. And it's a weird, politically trenchant version of Batman that was entirely a commentary on the DHS and the post-USA Patriot Act world. But it was done with the imprimatur of Batman. It was sold in all the places where DC Comics are sold. It was repped by DC's reps, and it got a distribution that your work-a-day, disgruntled, subversive comic about American surveillance and control would not have gotten because it's in DC and Marvel. And so that's what you get from them. They have yet to actually figure out how to clean house to stop all the weird stuff that's never going to be a movie. They are still full of people who actually love comics for their own sake, and as a result, some of this stuff sneaks in, and they do so much volume that even if only 0.5% of it is stuff that I care about, that's still as much as most indie presses are putting out.
Yeah, when people no longer know exactly what works or how to reproduce it, that's when a lot of really good, interesting stuff happens. A lot of the most innovative comics in the mainstream were comics that were done, like characters nobody cared about, and then we just hand it off, there's some British guy named Alan Moore, let's give him this pile of crap, see what he can do with it, and that's when things get really interesting. But what's cool is, you would think it would be a real brain drain, because what you're saying is right, Calvin, that we have this tremendous growth of the diversity of genre and diversity of content, diversity of style, diversity of formats, all these different things are streaming in. And you would think that what that would mean is that the old brontosauruses, Marvel and DC, would be so slow to react, and then all the really creative people would leave. But the thing is, there are just too many creative people. We have so many fantastic artists and writers. Just this bumper crop. Every year we have more and more incredibly talented people. There's not enough places to put them, and which means that the graphic novel scene has a lot of really talented people. The webcomic scene has a lot of really talented people. We continue to have, we have this tremendous growth in children's comics, and yes, even at Marvel and DC, you have some really creative, interesting projects.
And the thing is that there's the existence of the indie sector in terms of the deal that comics creators get is really dispositive. It's really important, because the worst deal that the two big players can offer you as a comics creator has to be better than the best deal that you can get if you walk out and try peddling your wares somewhere else. And so what we've seen with indie creators, whether that's Randall Munroe and KCD or Hugh Howey with Wolf, that when they make the jump from indie into the big five publishers, the big two comics, that they get to do things that no one else who's producing in those houses gets to do. Like Hugh Howey and Randall Munroe are probably the only two writers in the 21st century who've gotten to keep their ebook rights and sold to the big five. Like, I would be really surprised if there was another writer in any of those houses who, since the year 2001, has kept their ebook rights. But, who needs who more? Houghton Mifflin or Randall Munroe, Simon & Schuster or Hugh Howey? And so for us as creators who are in the mainstream, the existence of that robust independent sector reflects on our bottom line, because it raises the floor on the worst offer that our publishers can make to us.
We should probably have a quick show of hands for how many people know the name Randall Munroe. Yeah, no, just so you know, just does stick figures, does webcomic, and has 1 million readers a day. It's one of the smartest writers out there.
Yeah.
He doesn't even draw faces. I mean, like this blob, line, but incredibly funny and smart.
To your point, Scott, about just the explosion of talent, it's funny, I was talking with Bill Griffith, and he talked about a game he and Art Spiegelman used to play back in the day, in the 70s, guessing just how many cartoonists there were. And he guessed roughly back in the day that there may have been 250 working at any particular time. Yeah. They revisited that notion like a year or two ago, and neither one of them could come over because, so they just threw out a number, 10,000 perhaps. Sure, why not? But that's another aspect of the time we live in, the ability of artists, new, emerging, learning, actually to build an audience and move toward publication in one way or another, whether a mini comic or web comic or whatever.
Well,
yes, go ahead.
Oh, well, you gotta remember. Okay, we have graphic novels, we have comic strips, and the old newspaper comic strips still have them. Children's comics, web comics, all of these things, they're all under the umbrella of comics as an art form. I've been just sort of using, a lot of cartoonists just use comics as a sort of a generic to describe all of those things, just the art of putting one picture after another. Well, any art form like that, you really want it to be so diverse that the world that it contains, you shouldn't be able to see from one end to the other. There was a time in 1984 when I could sort of just sit down and contemplate for a moment. I could visualize the whole world of North American comics all at once. I could see the whole thing in my field of vision. You just can't do that anymore. Yeah. You can't see the whole world. You can't see from one horizon to another. That's as it should be. That's Absolutely. True of the written word. That's true of the moving image. That's true of this art form of organized sound we call music. That's how that should be true of sequential art.
And I think that there's a factor at play. We were talking last night about how when you drill down into any discipline, you get into truths that are universal to all of them. Yeah. And I think that that strikes a note for me about lots of different media that we've seen emerging in ebooks and video and so on, that when a new medium comes along, it takes all of the things that were shoehorned into the old medium because that was the only place we could put them, and it lets them breathe and be themselves. So before we had any kind of motion capture, motion film cameras of any description, any kind of show that you wanted to do that was a live show had to fit on a stage or in a puppet theater, right? And there were some stories that were just sort of wedged onto the stage, And then there were some stories that never came to light at all. So we can all think of movies today that could never be stage plays. And those just lurked, right? They just waited in potentia, waiting to be born, waiting for the medium to come along. And now we have books that are 1,000 pages long and books that are 3 pages long. And we have comics that are thousands of pages long and comics that are huge and comics that are small and comics that do all kinds of things that, like you wrote in the second? Reinventing comics,
My troubled middle child.
Like all troubled middle children, it's my favorite. I think all of the people I dated who had more than one sibling were troubled middle children until I settled down and married. But there are comics that literally couldn't have existed but for the new technologies, the new media. One of the things, we were talking about this earlier in the context of big brick comics like Sculptor, but also like Blankets and Habibi, is that new printing technologies and new economic systems have made this possible. So when you look up the new edition from D&Q of Blankets, printed in Malaysia, it's because making a cost-effective book that's this big is not a thing that we could do in North America. So one of the things that globalism has done is it's changed what kind of books we make too.
You know, since we're on big, I'm going to just segue very quickly. I want to talk a little bit about the sort of recent phenomenon, Arthur iTunes, terms and conditions. I mean, it's a wonderful conceptual graphic novel, if you want to put it that. I mean, he took the terms and conditions, the legal boilerplate, and just sort of recreated it with a million different comic styles in his way, as he's done before in his previous book, Masterpiece Comics. But one of the things he said was that he thought that the expansive graphic novel was characteristic of our time, and that's was something that he wanted to take on that challenge. So Scott, you've got a brick.
I've got a brick.
You've got a brick story.
I do. Well, first of all, just picture this now. What Bob Sikoryak did, he's really great at imitating other cartoonist styles. He took the entirety of the iTunes terms and conditions. Now, you've all read those, right? Well, you've all sat down. Yeah, you all checked the box that said you read it, right? There's about 70,000 words in that thing, and we all check it. Actually, there was a little widget. I forgot what the agreement was, but there was one of those 70,000 word agreements, and they had a little widget so that after you checked box says, yes, I have read and agree, it says, congratulations, you have read all 756 pages of our terms and agreements in, 2.1 seconds. So he takes this thing, and every page is in a different style of a cartoonist, from comics history. I even have one in there. And I mean, he did it in my style. And he's right that the brick, the big solid book, what Heidi MacDonald called the satisfying chunk, is a very, very important thing here, and something we saw coming. But what's interesting is that people like Craig Thompson, who was just here on this desk a moment ago before this panel, one thing that happens, and this relates to what you were saying, Cory, is that when you introduce a new format, new technology, new capabilities, some people seize on it right away, but there's actually a lag time where people still try to use the language of the previous format, the language of the previous technology. A lot of early movies were just filmed stage plays and whatnot. And the first graphic novels, the first comics that came out in 200 and 300 and 400 page chunks, a lot of them were still using the same pacing that you saw in the old 17 and 20 page comics. So people were just like, oh great, now I have 300 pages, I can cram that much more story in it. It took people like Craig Thompson to come along and say, you know what? I could have 4 pages of melting snow. Why not? I have the room. And that's what I tried to do with
manga too, when you say that the stretching out the narrative in ways that American comics really didn't do up until very recently in some ways.
Right, well manga was my model, and I think maybe Craig's too, to a degree.
Sure.
We looked at manga when we saw these series that went on for many hundreds of pages, and this was a kind of pacing now that people are used to. But it was very alien to us back in the 80s when I was first reading this stuff. And they would have, I remember my friend Kurt Busiek, who also makes comics, he writes comics now. But we grew up together, he got me into comics in middle school, and I got a hold of Lone Wolf and Cub, which went for thousands and thousands of pages, and there was like a 25-page sequence of a couple of people getting up out of the snow after a big battle. Just getting up out of the snow for 25 pages. Again, melting snow. It's a theme. And I remember just saying, isn't this amazing, Kurt? Look what they can do. Look what you can do with hundreds of pages. And Kurt was like, I could have done that in like 2 panels. To him, it was inefficient. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't.
No, that was great. I mean, I want to talk about, my bread and butter is the iTunes terms and conditions. It's not the graphic treatment of it. And I think that like the thing that made that brilliant was that he took the terms and conditions, because those terms and conditions. So Consumers Union published a consumer report, did some research, and they calculate that it would take 27 hours a day to read all the terms that you agree to. And we never read them because they all amount to like by being dumb enough to be my customer, you agree that I'm allowed to come over to your house and punch you in the mouth and eat your food and wear your underwear and make long distance calls, right? And the thing is that we've applied this to books and comics, and this is bringing it around into a full circle, right? That almost all of the electronic comics that are in the mainstream of commerce today, you buy labored with terms and conditions and with digital locks that lock them to one vendor's platform, that don't let you sell or loan them. You were talking about how your wife has a new collaborator who doesn't know about comics, and every time he comes over to your house, he goes home with a huge book bag of comics that he's using to discover the genre, so you can't lend them, you can't give them to your kids. All of it's hard to understand how lending would work in a digital context, but why is the default that if we can't figure out how something works, that the answer to solve it is, we just take away everything that was great for the readers and leave the stuff that worked for the publishers intact, right? Like, why is the default that we lose? And this is it's hugely important because it ties into things like our privacy, because now you have a fine-grained record of what you read. And if you think about comics have a history of being banned. Right? Like there was a long time in which being a comics fan was a thing that you didn't talk about for fear of losing your job, for fear of being socially ostracized. And the way that we got to a place where comics are now a multi-billion-dollar business and 200,000 people in the San Diego Convention Center every year is by there being a space in which people could participate in this medium without it being tracked in fine-grained and without it being to the knowledge of anyone except for the people they chose to disclose it to. And this is true not just in comics, but in lots of realms, right? Gay marriage is legal now. Many of us in this room today remember a time when being gay was a felony and you could go to jail for it. How did we get there? We got there because people could be gay in secret. And they could disclose it to their friends, and then that could be pushed out normatively. How do we get legal marijuana? How do we get all of these other social changes? So unless you believe that in 75 years, your great-grandchildren will come to you in your deathbed and say, how was it that all of the forms of literature that we enjoy today were considered legitimate in 2015 and no new ones have been freed up in the interim, then what we have done with the terms and conditions that he lampoons so beautifully in that book is we've sucked all the oxygen out of the room that we breathe in order to change our social mores. And as people who are participants in a medium that was totally illegitimate 25 years ago, that matters a lot.
I think Sikoriak also described the class of books that he worked on as long, difficult narratives that people are ashamed to admit they haven't read. So there you go.
The one thing about mine is even though it's 500 pages, you can read it in like 2
there you go.
2 or 3 hours, which is depressing on some levels, but they breeze through it.
I want to jump back.
And it's brilliant.
I want to jump back to diversity again, and in this case, a very specific kind of diversity, gender diversity. This is a time when I don't know if you're familiar with. When I usually test a crowd, when I say NBA, what do you think? The what? No, not NDA, NBA. See, that's the problem. It actually stands for the National Book Awards in many cases. All right, the preeminent American Literary Award, but that's okay. I actually played in a charity basketball game that was called the Other NBA, but that's a plug for me. The National Book Awards, the preeminent American Literary Award. Only 3 or 4 graphic novels have ever been nominated for it. Jing Yang was nominated twice. Yeah. Roz Chast was nominated and won, which was sort of amazing in the nonfiction category. Noelle Stevenson was nominated this year in the Young People's Literature. She did not win, but I got a great picture of her partying at the after party. So it's still a wonderful achievement. Let's talk a little bit about that. The role of women in both in mainstream and indie comics. Indie comics have been more welcoming in many cases. We're starting to see some changes. Where do we stand here? And certainly as with you, Cory, a book where this is really focuses on in IRL.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying I am conscious of the fact that I'm a white dude about to talk about the experience of my Chinese female collaborator, and that I am in no way qualified to do that, and the best person to ask about the experience of women in comics, the best people to ask is women and not men. So with that said, and with the enormous caveat that I know less by a factor of 3 or 4 orders of magnitude than women in comics know about the experience of women in comics, I will say that I wrote the short story that became In Real Life and the novel For the Win because I started dating the woman who's now my wife, who used to be a professional gamer. My wife used to play Quake for England. So she was on a nationally ranked team. She was a games developer and games producer. She ran the game strategy for the BBC and then for Channel 4 in the UK. And that put me in touch with sort of women in games, and I was interested in labor issues and race. And so I wrote this story about solidarity, solidarity across racial lines and solidarity across gender lines, where video games were the medium through which people came together. And I guess what I will say about women in comics apropos that is, although I wrote a novel about a young woman who games while living with a woman who is a gamer whose whole social network is games and so on, and she was my sounding board and my helper in that I think that when Jen turned her hand to this and rewrote my story about a woman who plays games, a young woman who plays games, from her perspective as someone who's actually been a young woman, that she infused it with stuff that I could have never put there. It is infinitely better for her contribution, not just because she did all the heavy lifting in the adaptation overall, but because her as a woman writing about women, and her as someone of Chinese descent writing about the elements that are set in China of my book. I went to China, I did research there, I bounced it off Chinese friends, but her as someone of Chinese descent has a mastery of that subject that I could never have, and I'm really grateful to First Second for finding me just the perfect collaborator on this project. It made it so much better, so much more than any of my own cracks at this story. You know, I've written a novel and a short story about this, so much better than my own.
Yeah, really highly recommend. In Real Life is just such a gorgeous, fantastic book, and what Cory is writing about, what he and Jen collaborated on, also is not a kind of a story that you've seen a million times. It investigates desires and conflicts that aren't necessarily familiar. They're not just retreading old ground. When I think of women in comics, I, as the other, I mean, it's a sausage fest up here. It tends to happen that way, and I'm sorry. But I keep going back to the big bang of manga here in the States back in the mid-90s. And, there was it's funny because, what happened is we had a lot of kids reading, cross-legged in Barnes & Noble. And we had this tremendous explosion of manga, and a lot of those kids, they went on to grow up and read other sorts of things, but a significant minority of them continued to read comics, and a significant minority there continued to started making comics of their own, and most of them were women. And back in 2004, I made a sort of informal prediction that we'd have a majority female industry by 2024. And I actually think we're a little ahead of schedule. And so to me, when we talked about the tensions of like a male-dominated industry, all I could think was, well, just wait. I'm pretty sure we're going to have a minority male industry by then, by 2024, and probably before that. Most of the winners of the Eisner Awards this year were women. All of the winners, I believe, of the Ignatz Awards at the Small Press Comics Expo in Maryland were women. Yeah. It's happening. It's the changing of the guard. And a lot of it began with manga. And also, and a lot of it has to do with the resurgence of children's comics, which is creating a whole new generation of readers, thanks to artists like Raina Telgemeier.
And really just one great female creator after another, going into the children's graphic novel business. And just to return to manga for a second, from my role as a reporter in the book trade, I mean, you'll hear us talk here about the traditional mainstream comics industry and the book trade, which is exerting a really powerful influence on what comics will be and have become. Manga absolutely transformed comics in the book trade, where essentially comics did not really exist except as a sporadic, occasional product. The category in the book trade really, before really 2000, just really didn't exist that much. You can kind of go back to perhaps Mouse as really kind of the first really significant to come out of Pantheon. And when I say the trade, I'm talking about the big New York houses and book publishers, for the most part, prose publishers who publish for general bookstores. Manga absolutely transformed the book trade by making it clear that actually book format comics could sell in numbers that publishers would respect.
Yeah.
And at the same time, early manga, which was predominantly shoujo, really transformed it because these were comics designed for women and girls. Girls were already in the bookstore space in great numbers beyond young men. It really turned the bookstore into a place where you can go now and see a diverse list of comics of all kinds. So manga and women readers have transformed this landscape yet again.
So to go back to Marvel and DC, I think that one gap that they left for far too long, back when we had lots of bookstores, right? Back when there were more physical bookstores, there was this weird moment where you could if you never went to a comic store, especially not on Wednesdays when new comics came in, you could still discover a new comic by going into a bookstore and getting the first Perfect Bound collection. But then, so that would be the first 10 issues, or first 12, or first 6. But then if you then went, oh my god, this is so good, finally a reason to start going to the comic store and buying floppies, and you went to the comic store, they would say, we have you've read up to 10, we have 14 and on. And there was no way to get 11 through 13. And it was this big gap that now Comixology fills that to a certain extent, but for a really long time, there was no way to migrate those bookstore fans into monthly fans. And the thing about monthly fans is they're actually weekly shoppers, right? Only a small number of book readers, I'm a recovering bookseller, only a small number of book readers are weekly visitors to the bookstore, but a huge number of floppy readers come to the bookstore every Wednesday. And, that, like, from a retail perspective, like, what would Macy's pay to have a product that brought some plurality of its customers in every single Wednesday? And Marvel and DC were like, do you know how hard it would be for us to figure out how to give you PDFs of the ones that aren't out in trade papers now? Like, that's transcendentally hard. What do you think we are, magicians? And nothing happened for years. And it was I think it was one of the great historical missed opportunities.
Oh, so many. If we get on missed opportunities historically, we'll be here forever.
Well, this is a perfect time to segue to digital comics. Where do we stand on digital comics? Where do we stand on other variations on digital comics? I like subscription digital comics through either one of the larger services like Scribd, which is actually predominantly for pros, but actually they launched a 10,000 title category of comics and graphic novels. And as they told me, it was one of the most incredible launches of any of their categories through it. So where do we stand now? We see in some cases, certainly in the traditional print industry now, that ebook sales have slowed down. I think to some extent, conventional publishers are reading the wrong message from this. They feared ebooks, and they certainly feared the pricing of ebooks. So where are we now as digital comics seem to really be catching on, and in another way, sending fans into print stores in many ways and into comic shops as well, looking for this new world of diverse comics?
Well, this is where I start choking on my own word balloon because it's just there's so much to say. I'm in a very weird place. I mean, I was one of the first people in North America to become like full-time obsessed with digital comics. I mean, literally even before the web got started, I was looking at the possibilities for comics in a digital environment, and the CD-ROM, the long lamented CD-ROM scene. And I had a lot of very high hopes, both creatively and in terms of distribution. And my last project was a graphic novel, and it was designed for the device. The thing is a book. And the reason was I was very dissatisfied with the reading formats that we had for long-form stuff. There was a big split that isn't often acknowledged between comic strips and graphic novels, the long-form stuff. The strips did really well online, just out in the wild web. They did tremendously, and we've had genuine success stories. People worry about newspaper comics disappearing. Just the newspaper part is disappearing. There are more strips than ever before. There are thousands more strips, and some of them are tremendously popular. So it was the format. That was a shotgun marriage as far as I'm concerned, the relationship between newspapers and comic strips in the beginning of the 20th century. There was always an uneasy linkage. But anyway, but meanwhile, if you want to do something that lasts for 300 or 400 pages, you have to be able to create that spell. Like what we expect when we're binge watching a show or watching a 2.5-hour movie, we want to be able to lose ourselves in that experience. And I think we have some really just kind of, pardon my language, but kind of shitty reading experiences as far as the long form stuff goes. I'm not keen on pan and scan. I really hate it when we have upright rectangular pages that are just imported for print. So it's just a creative thing. It's just an aesthetic thing for me that I don't really feel like we have an entirely successful reading model. Also, right now we have a tension between the idea of responsive design in comics because, this notion of responsive design that content ought to just be able to flow very naturally from one device to another. Oh, I'm going to enjoy it on my desktop, then on my laptop, then on my tablet, then on my phone, and it all just reflows. But comics is defined by the shape of its presentation. In comics, it matters what shape it is. It matters what size it is. The juxtaposition of images next to each other, it matters. And so there's a tension there. So really, I just took a holiday. I went away. I made a graphic novel. And I concentrated just on creating for a book during that period. On the knowledge, not that my frustration sort of drove me away, but knowing that in a networked world, solutions are going to grow up around this problem, that this problem will be solved. But after banging my head against a wall for about 10 or 12 years, I just figured, let somebody else work on this for a while. I'm actually very optimistic about it, but I think right now when we look back at this period, we'll see it as a period during which we hadn't quite worked out just the usability, the reading experience. This is a usability problem. And one of the key aspects of that usability is that when you're reading a book, when you are reading a graphic novel in any form, you should have your eyes on the content the whole time. You should never look away for navigation. And you should never have to, compromise or have it retrofitted. We never put up with pan and scan on movies on television. Does anyone remember, is anyone old enough to remember, spaghetti westerns on television and they would like move the, thing across because the aspect ratio is gone? We wouldn't put up with that now. We shouldn't put up with it with comics either. But that's end of rant.
So I am going to posit, lurking in potentia, a kind of graphic storytelling where that is size and position independent.
It can be done.
I'm going to posit that such a thing might exist.
Oh no, it absolutely can.
And that may be in the same way that what we were waiting for film was a kind of visual story. If you watch old movies, there's a lot of people walking back and forth because they do this in stage plays, right? There's this stage direction moment where you need to fill some space or you need to fill some time or you need to let a line set in and people cross from one side of the stage to the other. And then someone invented cutting for films. I will just do. You don't have these people like walking to the bar and making a martini and then turning around and saying, I think you're wrong. Right? I mean, you can just cut to them holding the martini. I think you're wrong. I think that we are living in a kind of age of very amazing digital comics that are so ubiquitous we don't notice them. And I think it started with the giant Little Nemo books. So if you want to talk about something that's presentation dependent, I'd grown up reading Little Nemo reproductions that were 8.5 by 11 or maybe A4 size, and they were terrible, right? Little Nemo, Winsor McCay's old comics from the beginning of the 20th century, they were paintings that were this big. They were tabloid-sized paintings. And reproduced like this, they're terrible. They're really visually uninteresting, hard to read, not all that cool. And one super dedicated fan was able to scan them at original resolution. They're all in the public domain, source a printer in the Far East, print them, use the internet to find the 1,000 people who wanted to buy that first printing and sell it through and do several printings since. It's now become a very common format. You see artist sketchbooks from IDW and so on that are in that format. That is a digital comic in as much as it's a thing that only exists because the internet exists. Right?
Well, this is an incredibly important point. As soon as we had this non-tangible alternative world, people immediately, everybody got obsessed with this idea, is print going to cease to exist or whatever? It's like, no, print just became visible for the first time. When I was starting out in comics, we all just were printing this stuff on newsprint and sometimes slightly better white paper. That was it. That was the means by which we got from A to B. We were looking for efficiency. We didn't even see the paper. The paper was ubiquitous. It was ubiquitous the way that air is ubiquitous for a musician, and you're sending your stuff across, the air with vibrations in the air. It's like you don't even notice that anymore because that's how it always is. But as soon as there was that non-tangible alternative, suddenly we saw what was in our hands for the very first time, and that's when you began to see beautiful print. That's when you got to see people like Chris Ware come along and say, I'm going to really think about the choice of paper. I'm going to think about the format. I'm going to create beautiful objects. I'm going to create something that's tangible and that has some aesthetic value for its tangibility.
I think that's all true, but what I'm talking about here is digital technology like shipping containers, right? Like it's global shipping, it's sourcing, overseas sourcing, it's the ability to find audiences. I think we are now in the crowd-funded age of digital comics, and I don't mean comics that are produced digitally. I mean comics whose end product is digital. I mean comics whose life is owed to the ability of the internet to connect audiences that are spread in a kind of Gaussian distribution all over the world without any one concentration that's tight enough to make it worth anyone's while to do traditional retail, that nevertheless makes it possible to have these improbable books that just couldn't have existed before. And that is the golden age of digital comics. Just because the end product isn't digital doesn't mean that those aren't digital comics. Those are so digital.
The invisible hand of digital infrastructure that's actually making some of the most gorgeous print books amazing. In fact, Locust Moon's Eisner-winning Little Nemo, an oversized, incredible tribute edition that indeed is as papery and as bookish as you would want. But certainly Kickstarter had an amazing ability to bring that
and certainly in keeping with the spirit of the original. The idea of being at the dawn of a new century.
So, very good point. The digital is in there making these things possible, even when perhaps we're assuming that it's got to be something you read on a screen. But that isn't necessarily the case.
No, that's a good point.
But this is a perfect time to turn our audience into an audience of moderators. And I see a question. We're going to alternate genders, so let's see some other hands up there.
As women or non-binary,
I'll start with the guy because he's got his hand up. But ladies, get ready.
We're doing Panel Syndicate and Private Eye, which is for now digital only, and they took advantage of the format. He designed it with tablets in mind.
I mentioned that the fact that I really believe in designing for the device, which, despite what Cory is saying, yes, you can absolutely create something that is very responsive and can flow to a multitude of devices. But that's an aesthetic choice, and it's not one that I want people to feel coerced to make. So I think anyone who chooses to keep what they do creatively within a particular environment is making a creative choice that I think is very defensible. And sometimes that's a creative choice that actually results in, a harder time down the road. When my very first webcomics, I didn't want there to be any originals. I actually created them at 72 dots per inch because I was so fanatical about it that I wanted it to be impossible to print the things. Now, of course, on modern screens, they're this big. They're the size of a postage stamp. So, joke's on you, McCloud. But still, these are aesthetic choices that I think people ought to feel comfortable about making. I see the Night Vale T-shirt, by the way, back there. Yeah, sure.
I think that those old 72 DPI comics, though, are great in the same way that seeing the chisel marks on the side of the pyramids are great too. I mean, I think that just because I can see your jaggies doesn't detract from it. It makes it better.
Sign of the process. Yeah. Next question.
Are there any women or people who identify as non-binary? Thank you.
Yes.
Well, we were talking about digital comics and how the whole landscape is changing as our technology changes. Do you think then how is criticism of comics going to change as the medium continues to evolve?
Yeah.
Well,
Good point.
Yeah.
Well,
Calvin.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily consider myself a comics critic. I'm more of a comics journalist. So I'm a little fuzzy on responding. I mean, I certainly think different medium is going to require you to approach it in a different way. But I also believe that looking at stories, how they affect you, talking about them in a formal way, it certainly will change as the comics come to you in a new kind of form. But I'm a comics journalist. I'm really, I'm actually far more interested in surveying the landscape of comics and seeing how they're delivered, who's making them, who's reading them, what is the business side. I mean, and as you see, most of my questions are on that. How the market is transformed, how the market transforms how comics are made. So I'm a little bit more on the journalism side. I'm a little more interested in how the book trade, to me, the book trade was part of the natural evolution of comics out of a purely periodical form into what I still consider, in my old-fashioned way, the ultimate vehicle, the book. And that the book, whether it's a brick that you carry around or an extended, difficult narrative that, you may or may not finish reading. So, I mean, that's my fudge of an answer. But
well, the biggest change for me, I think, is that in our current environment, the critical sphere it's more or less just sort of a scatter plot, like that you just have it's like this very broadly distributed, scattered environment of detecting the shape of a creative endeavor. Like it's the somewhat crude example is something like Rotten Tomatoes, where you have aggregators, of critical opinion, but also you just sort of get a sense of a thing from reading other people's comments about it on social networks or even formal reviews. After a while, it feels as if you've triangulated the shape of it from all these different viewpoints. You can begin to see it, like that awful scene in Daredevil with the rain and him trying, I don't know, that's a terrible example. But it's not a bad scene, it's just not a great movie. But, it's just, that's what we were always looking for. I think we were looking for the critical sphere to help guide us to work, to help us make sense of the work, but like Calvin is saying, also to help us make sense of the scene as a whole. And maybe that's in fact more critical weight is going to be moving towards that idea of like, what have we just seen? Not what should you see, but what have you just seen? Can we make sense of what's changing, what's happening to the scene as a whole? That might be more where critics are focusing in the future.
I think that one critical dimension that's super important in the digital age is that authors are expected to be much more social. And particularly if we're talking about things like Kickstarter comics, that your personal story and your relationship to your audience, your personal relationship to your audience, not just your relationship through your work, is a critical piece of how you are funded, like your economic life, as well as how you're understood critically. And as a consequence, there is a personal dimension to the performance of being a creator that's kind of not been front and center unless you lived in New York or unless maybe you lived in LA or read the trades. Like now, so like I just discovered inadvertently and to my great horror that Nissim Taleb, the Black Swan guy, is like a career Twitter asshole. And he came out, he had this bizarre argument in favor of homeopathy, and I said, that's awfully dumb. And for like 5 days, I've had to mute him, because for 5 days now, he's been like, you are a fraud, you are an idiot, you are a fool, just like this kind of continuous stream. He calls people retards. Like, there's actually a parody account called Nice Nissim Taleb that just rephrases everything he says without the ad hominem. So that has become, like, in terms of the critical discourse, right, people being angry at authors and the views of the author being entangled with the art has become very central. But the other thing is, the notion of problematic media, which is especially key to comics, has become much more mainstream. The idea that you can like things even though there are parts of them that are problematic. And the way that that gets expressed is so much in fan culture and also so much in ways that are fraught in terms of policy around copyright and the internet. So like all this fan discourse where people rewrite problematic scenes to show how problematic they are and post them to major fanfic sites and then can have it censored off the internet without any judicial review by the author complaining that this critical work displeases them. Like all of that is new, sui generis to the internet, never been present before. I mean, yeah, people wrote slash fic and whatever before, but it was always below the notice and the enforcement reach of rights holders, and now it's like it's right there, right? Like you can fire off an email, boom, it just goes away. We yesterday got a lawsuit threat from Max Mosley, the son of the neo-Nazi who runs Formula One racing, who's into sadistic bondage scenes, and there was a thing that leaked about this, and we had published something about it in 2008, and he threatened to like take us for everything we had yesterday unless we removed all notice of it. So that kind of critical discourse is now more fraught than ever too.
So he's litigious.
Oh, he is.
What a shock.
Yeah. The litigious son of a neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
This is like my favorite joke, World War II joke is like, do you know why they didn't allow liquor in the Reichstag? It's because Hitler was a mean drunk.
And on that note,
You know, that is the third band name you've come up with. I have Satisfying Chunk, I have Cross-Legged at Barnes & Noble, and now I have Hitler Was a Mean Drunk. Those are my next three bands.
male identified? If not, then we'll switch it. Okay, you, right there.
Yeah, well, talking about the kind of digital space, how do you guys see that helping with the diversification of gendered readers into comics? Because obviously, you know, the comic shop has traditionally been a very male-centric space, but now with comicsology and the ability to create more gender-friendly spaces to discuss or create that discourse around comics, do you see that helping with that diversification?
That's one for you, I think.
Oh, yeah, I think here, simple metaphor is this. Do you want biodiversity in a natural setting? Imagine that every new sapling of any new species, any new baby, any new egg is destroyed and is birthed. That's the traditional physical. If you only have the traditional market, then you have that problem that everybody's competing for shelf space. And when you're competing for shelf space, any new untried genre, any new untried style, any new untried kind of background for creators is automatically at a disadvantage. And so you don't have the growth of new genres. When there's no shelf space in cyberspace, as there isn't, then you can have something new. People can try out new genres, and with new genres come new viewpoints, new backgrounds for the creators, the writers, the artists. New voices can start on the same footing as everybody else, and if they gain a readership, that readership can grow and grow and grow without any sort of restrictions at all. And that's how you've had these new genres just explode. And also this balkanization of genre, where the genres start just metastasizing and then splitting off into 100 little miniature subgenres and that sort of thing. And that's what was going on for the last 10, 15 years, 20 years really, since the web really got rolling, is that you simply don't have the economies of scale when it applied to genre. And that's where a lot of diversity has come from. It's just the simple fact that you can do your comic about, I don't know, frog collecting in, I don't know, I can't come up with a good random example, but like anything at all, you can make a comic about that and you can find your audience through the side door. That's a terrible answer. I'm listening to myself. It's like, what is he talking about? I do
a graphic novel gift guide every year, and one of the wonderful top volumes that I listed this year was The Story of Beer. And it's a graphic history of beer from its origins to the rise of craft brewing. But I'm curious if this also is a social space that's changing for comics, about the explosion of new kinds of shows beyond the mega pop culture cons of the East and West Coast. We were talking about this a little earlier. TCAF. These are different kinds of social spaces, and certainly the gendering of these spaces is very different than what we have traditionally seen in the major comics show. Have you seen the same?
Yeah, we're talking about the festival circuit, the rise of local festivals, art comics festivals, and it's the changing face of comics, and it's partially generational. I think a lot of it has to do with just the aging of progressively more diverse generations. We have a lot of work still to do, but there's no mechanism for perpetuating the status quo. That's a dangerous thing to say. Stop. I strike that from the record. There are always mechanisms for perpetuating the status quo, but it is more difficult, and it's especially more difficult in a truly open web.
And I want to say that as much as demographics and other things are in the favor of diversity, that part of the way that we got diversity, the diversity that we have today in comics and in other artistic fields, is not through historic inevitability, but through the blood, sweat, toil, and tears of people who really took enormous personal risks.
Sure,
and who fought really hard and were treated very badly by the industry and hung in there and were served as examples and mentored people so that people recognized faces that looked like their own in the industry. This was not...
That's true.
And I don't think you were saying that, but for clarity,
Yeah.
this was
Yeah.
not an accident of history. This was hard work.
That's true, yeah, absolutely.
In the back, sure.
This is directed at you. I'm an educator, and I got introduced to you through Another Place, Another Time. That story was placed in our textbook, and I loved it, and so did my kids. And I spent a lot of time with it, and then one day I put in my Alan Parsons CD. I'm an Alan Parsons fan, and I heard this song, Time. And I went, I wonder if Cory Doctorow heard this song and created this story, Another Place, Another Time. Not done. So I emailed you, and you never responded. My kids are waiting. They're in 8th grade now. I've been happy to share with them that I met you, and I came in late. No relation to E.L. Doctorow?
No. I'm sorry I missed your email. You know what I thought you were going to say? I thought you were going to say I emailed you and you emailed me back in 5 minutes, which is what I usually do. So I did not deliberately not respond to you. I answer all of my mail. And if I didn't respond to you, it's because I mistook it for spam based on the subject line, or it just fell off the side. I apologize.
Okay.
It was not based on the Alan Parsons song. It was based on a presentation I saw at the Perimeter Institute, which is a quantum physics research institute endowed by the Research in Motion people near the University of Waterloo in Ontario. So, not an Alan Parsons thing. Sorry, but that was a fun story to write.
She has your book.
Oh, great.
Oh, and I just want to say that I think you have an upcoming story in Boing Boing on the front page that's going to say, Cory Doctorow answers all of his emails.
I'm an inbox zero person, so I'm pretty hardcore about it.
So there you go. So feel free to email them. So look, we're really getting down to our last few minutes, but I am curious if there are any works you would care to sing out about and talk about.
So I have the paperback of my nonfiction book about information policy and creativity in the 21st century, which is called Information Doesn't Want to Be Free. Came out in paperback last week. They have it at the McSweeney's tent. I've signed them all. And I have just sold my next novel for adults, which will be called Walk Away. And second, we'll be doing my first picture book, which is called Posey the Monster Slayer.
Mine is up there. That's my new graphic novel, The Sculptor. I also want to recommend, there are a couple of things that came along that I really loved. It's just translated recently. I think it's a few years old. I really like Beautiful Darkness, and I wish I could pronounce the names of all involved, but it was translated over from, I think, the French. It's depressing as hell, but it's a really, really great book. Beautiful Darkness, if you can find that one. And then another that'll come to me in a minute, but go ahead.
So I just remembered one. Sorry, Phoebe and Her Unicorn.
Yes, you were talking about today. It sounds fabulous.
Amazing comic strip, like funny animal comic strip, sort of in the Calvin and Hobbes model, except where the being mean to kids who are of the opposite sex is not the source of any of the humor. It's just it's super great, kid and adult. They're on their third collection, and it's if Calvin was an awesome little girl, and instead of Hobbes being an imaginary friend, it's a unicorn who's actually real, but she has this field of boringness that makes her unremarkable to the adults in Phoebe's life. So she occasionally comes to school with her and kind of hangs out with her, and she's just there, and her parents are like, "Is your unicorn coming to dinner again tonight?" It's
so boring.
Amazing. It's so good.
I'm just going to point out, PW does Publishers Weekly does a best books list, and we are the comics editors. We get to pick 5 books, and so you can go to our site and see them, but very quickly I just would love them because these 5 are really extraordinary. There are way more than 5 tremendous graphic novels out this year, but I would send you all to look out Jillian Tamaki's Super Mutant Magic Academy, Representative John Lewis's March Book 2, the 2nd volume of his extraordinary memoirs of being a really great American during the Civil Rights Movement. Adrian Tomini's Killing and Dying, a wonderful collection of short stories. Sophie Goldstein's The Oven. And also, outside of the PW Best books, I would have put it on there if I could have squeezed it in. Really remarkable science fiction work. It's called Concrete Park by Tony Perrier and Erica Alexander. I think a really beautiful Afrofuturist vision of a multicultural, indeed multiplanetary future that takes place on a prison island. Wonderful books. I think at that point we're going to have to wind this up. A big hand for our 2 panelists here, and read more comics.